You ever wondered about the worst time to be a human? Most people will point to the year 536 AD, the so-called darkest year in recorded history. A volcanic eruption dimmed the sun, crops failed, and empires staggered. It was brutal, yes, but those are modern luxuries, tragedies remembered because somebody wrote them down. If you push further back, before chronicles, before empires, even before farming, you find something worse. A time when our genus had barely stepped out of the cradle, when being human meant being a prey, a small and fragile one at that, barely smarter than the others. A world where childhood usually ended before you turned 12. That was the world of Homo Habilis. The Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania is where we first meet them, and where we see how short their lives could be. In 2010, paleontologist Christopher Brochu and colleagues described the fossils of a new crocodile from those same deposits. And when you find a predator along with human remains, it rarely means good news. They called it Crocodylus anthropophagus, the man-eater. All the early Homo bones found at the site bore puncture marks that matched the croc's teeth with unnerving precision. This predator could stretch up to 7 meters in length, bulkier than any Nile crocodile alive today, armored and crowned with horn-like ridges above the eyes. When it hit with 1.5 tons of muscle and bone-crushing jaws. One habilis tibia shows a clean pierce all the way through, the signature of a limb torn in ambush. Another skull fragment was scored as if dragged across a mouth lined with conical teeth. These were kill shots, no scavenging. Olduvai is often presented as humanity's workshop, the birthplace of stone tools, where handyman chipped flakes into cutting edges. But alongside those flakes lie bones that tell a darker truth. For Homo habilis, technology wasn't triumph. It was survival, measured against predators they could never truly escape. So, if you're asking about the worst time to be human, the evidence doesn't point to kings or plagues. It points to a broken shin bone, dragged out of a crocodile's jaws 2 million years ago. And that's just the opening scene. If you managed to dodge the giant-ass crocodiles, you still had the rest of the world stacked against you. In 2021, paleoanthropologist Jeremy De Silva and colleagues published a review of early Homo life histories in Nature. Their conclusion? Most Homo habilis never made it to their teenage years. Average lifespan? About 12. And that's the generous version. Infant remains are usually undercounted in the fossil record. Tiny bones don't preserve well, which means the real death toll in the first years of life was probably higher than what we can see. If we factor in the babies who died before they left much trace, the average drops even lower. So 12 isn't really an age to look forward to. It's an optimistic ceiling. The statistics are crushing. One dataset of 26 habilis individuals suggested that around 40% died before the age of 10. And even for the survivors, the danger didn't ease up. Around puberty, mortality spiked again. Researchers call this the maximum mortality window. Why, would you ask? Because that's when biology and the environment teamed up to knock you down. Your body was in overdrive, growing fast but still small, weak-boned and accident-prone. You were old enough to leave the safety of constant care, but not strong enough to defend yourself. That meant more time on the ground, more exposure to predators, more chances to fall from trees. Add in a calorie-hungry growth spurt in a world where food was unreliable, and adolescence became the deadliest gamble of all. The irony writes itself. If you'd already beaten the odds to reach 10, that's exactly when your chances of dying went up. What did this look like in practice? Picture a band of 60 or 70 habilis, somewhere on the East African savanna. A crowd dominated not by weathered elders, but by children, most of whom wouldn't live long enough to bury their parents. Grandparents were practically a mythical thing back then. Wisdom couldn't accumulate, experience rarely survived. Societies reset themselves every few years because the majority never had time to grow old. And unlike our own species, where we can measure life in decades, habilis had to measure it in fragments. 7 years was already a decent run. 10 was a small miracle. 20? You were the Methuselah of your group, a living fossil before your molars even finished wearing down. So the worst time to be human wasn't just violent, it was heartbreakingly short, a world where children weren't preparing for adulthood. They were the adulthood, because in Homo Habilis, life didn't start at 40. It usually ended before 12. Even if you did survive childhood, you were still trapped in a body that wasn't built for durability. Adult Homo habilis stood barely 4 feet tall on average, about the size of a modern 10-year-old. They weighed maybe 60% of what we do, and unlike later hominins, they didn't make up for small stature with sturdiness. Their bones were gracile, their joints light. In practice, that meant one bad fall could cripple you for life, and habilis were still partly arboreal. They climbed, they slipped, and unlike chimps, they didn't have the anatomy to absorb the shock. Kind of the worst of both worlds. Now add teeth into the mix. In 2006, Peter Unger and colleagues published a study on the dental microwear of early Homo in Journal of Human Evolution. Under the microscope, habilis molars look like gravel chewed by gravel. Scratches and pits so severe that even juveniles, kids under 10, already had cracked enamel. One specimen, estimated at 17 years old, so already a grand ancestor at the time, had dental wear comparable to a modern elderly human with decades of neglect. Imagine being a teenager with the mouth of a 70-year-old chain smoker. That wasn't an outlier, that was the norm. So why did everything seem so bad? It all points to diet. Habilis weren't picky eaters because they couldn't afford to be. They cracked bones to suck out marrow, gnawed on tough plant fibers, and chewed sinew off carcasses. In other words, everything abrasive that could keep you alive for another day also sanded your teeth down like sandpaper. Unfortunately, that didn't help to extend their lifespans much. Worn teeth weren't just painful, they were lethal. If you couldn't chew, you couldn't eat. In a world without soup, blenders, or soft bread, a shattered molar could kill you just as surely as a predator's claw. So between fragile bones and ruined teeth, habilis lived in bodies that aged faster than their years. By the time you reached your 20s, you weren't just rare, you were already worn out. They were called handyman for their tools, but the fossils tell a crueler truth. Habilis themselves were anything but handy. If fragile bones and wrecked teeth weren't enough, Homo habilis also picked the worst possible job description: scavenger. On paper, it sounds clever. Let the big predators do the hard work, then swoop in for leftovers. You don't have the build to take down large prey, so low-risk, high-reward strategy looks like the right thing to do. Except for habilis, it was more like high-risk, questionable reward. Their toolkit was the Oldowan. Simple flakes and choppers, sharp enough to split bone but laughably crude compared to what came later. Useful for scraping marrow, not much else. In 2007, Christopher Egelin's taphonomic analysis of Olduvai gorge carcasses showed that habilis rarely had first access. The marks on bones came after carnivores had already been at them. In other words, habilis weren't hunters carving steaks. They were latecomers cracking shin bones, hoping there was still something left. Now, I don't see any risk, though, is what you'd say if you followed up till now. But here's the problem. Habilis wasn't the only scavenger at the time, and he was far from being the most impressive. Egeland noted that, at best, habilis could defend scraps from jackals or cheetahs. Against anything bigger, they were done. Imagine living in a neighborhood where you can only bully the smallest cats, while everything larger is bullying you. That's not a niche, that's a death sentence. The issue is, because habilis needed marrow and meat to survive, they just had no choice but to keep rolling those dice. Every trip to a carcass was a gamble. Would they eat, or would they be eaten? The irony is brutal. The species nicknamed handyman wasn't innovating its way out of danger. It was staking its survival on being the world's most underqualified scavenger. A strategy that kept them alive just long enough to die young. In a way, scavenging was less a survival tactic than a slow-motion form of Russian roulette. Except habilis never stopped pulling the trigger. Scavenging meant stepping into a crowded arena. And Homo habilis didn't just compete with scavengers. They lived inside one of the most predator-packed ecosystems that ever existed. Africa, 2 million years ago, was not the Africa we know today. It was worse. Bigger, hungrier, and far less forgiving. The most infamous were the saber-toothed cats. Among them was Meganterion, a predator roughly the size of a jaguar but built like a heavyweight. Its forelimbs were lion-sized, thick with muscle, designed to pin struggling prey. Once it had you on the ground, the canines did the rest. They weren't carving knives like smilodons, but narrower, optimized for puncture and suffocation. The evidence isn't hypothetical. A Homo habilis skull fragment from Olduvai Gorge carries puncture marks on the parietal bone, angled in a way that rules out scavenging. The bite came from the front. The animal had clamped its jaws over the face. For that individual, the world ended not in fire or famine, but in the suffocating grip of Meganterion's muzzle. And Meganterion wasn't alone. Dinophilis, the so-called false saber-tooth, haunted wooded edges. Standing at over 300 pounds, it was heavier than a leopard and shorter than a lion, specialized in ambush. In South African caves, its tooth marks match perfectly with the skulls of hominins. It might be called false saber-tooth, but when your name translates into terrible feline in the exact same way as dinosaurs, it's very telling. And Habilis didn't have to worry only about the big cats, because if the cats killed with precision, the hyenas killed with blunt force. The most terrifying was Pachacracuta brevirostris, the giant hyena. Standing as tall as a lioness and weighing over 100 kilograms, it carried jaws so strong that paleontologists rank its bite force among the greatest of any mammal ever. Imagine the crunch of a garbage truck compactor. That's the sound Pachacracuta could make out of bone. Enough to bend 6mm steel plates, and both were standing on the exact same niche. Homo habilis needed marrow for calories, Pachacracuta too. The clash was inevitable, and Habilis was hopelessly outmatched. Fossil assemblages from Eurasia and Africa show bone-cracking patterns so extreme that marrow cavities look like they'd been put through an industrial shredder. For Habilis, running into one hyena was bad enough. A pack of them meant extinction on the spot. And that was just in addition to all the regulars we still know today, the leopards and lions. Their weapons haven't changed. At Swartkran's Cave in South Africa, the famous hominin skull SK54 tells the story in 2 holes. Both puncture marks line up exactly with a leopard's canine spacing. The teeth had driven straight through both eye sockets, piercing right through the brain. That fossil is 1.8 million years old, meaning Habilis and its cousins were already on the leopard's menu. Even snakes joined the gauntlet. We have no direct Habilis skeleton with fang marks, but primatologists argue snakes were a major evolutionary pressure on early hominins, hence the fear most people have with them. It's been engraved in us by millions of years of predation. Today, venomous bites kill tens of thousands across Africa every year. Constrictors can take down prey far larger than Habilis. For Homo habilis, this was normal life. No safe zone. On the ground, saber-tooths. At carcasses, hyenas. In the trees, leopards. In the grass, snakes. Predators didn't just shorten their lifespans, they defined the edges of existence. Every path to food ran through someone else's jaws. And that was just land. The rivers were worse. Homo habilis had a taste for fish, a valuable calorie source. But without nets or spears, fishing meant wading in with bare hands. And every trip to the shoreline was a gamble, because the water hid monsters. The most infamous we mentioned earlier, Crocodylus anthropophagus. And if you know how crocs hunt, you know how brutal it can be. 2 juvenile habilis were found with their legs and feet mauled in exactly the pattern of a croc ambush. First clamp the limbs, then drag under, then the death roll. These weren't accidents. This was the feeding strategy of a specialist. But being the most famous doesn't mean you get to be alone. Because fossils from the same region revealed Crocodylus thorbjarnarsoni, the largest true crocodile ever discovered. At 8 meters long, it was effectively an armored submarine with teeth. Its skull was unusually broad, an adaptation for crushing armored prey like giant turtles. But if a 4-foot-tall hominin wandered too close, it hardly mattered what the skull was designed for. When you're that tall, everything that moves is food. Even the holotype of Homo habilis, specimen OH7, the original handyman, may have been claimed by a croc. Its foot and leg bones carry deep puncture wounds consistent with crocodile teeth. To make matters worse, the skull shows separate feline damage. The miserable truth? OH7 might have survived a croc attack only to be mauled later by a big cat. For Habilis, water was not safety. It was another killing field. Rivers offered fish, yes, but also jaws wide enough to crush bone, drag you under, and spin your limbs off in seconds. On land, Habilis was outmatched. In water, it was hopeless. Probably it can't get any worse, right? Oh, hell no! Quite often when talking about predators, for some reason, birds gets overlooked. But they really shouldn't. The best evidence comes from another early hominin, the famous Tong child, an Australopithecus africanus fossil from South Africa, about 2.8 million years old. When Raymond Dart described it in the 1920s, he thought it had been murdered by other hominins. Decades later, microscopic study of the eye sockets told a different story. The puncture marks matched perfectly with the talons of a crowned eagle, a raptor still alive in Africa today. Crowned eagles are powerful hunters and very capable of killing monkeys the size of a human child. They strike from above, driving claws into the skull, often piercing through the eye sockets. The Tong child fossil preserves exactly that grim signature, the unmistakable imprint of talons through bone. For Homo habilis, the implications are clear. Adults, at 4 feet tall and 30 kilos or more, were probably too heavy to be carried off. But their children, the very age group already most likely to die young, fell squarely into the eagle's preferred prey range. A 2-year-old habilis might weigh 10 to 15 kilos, the same as a modern vervet monkey. In a world where predators crowded every niche, even the sky wasn't safe. So while habilis worried about saber-tooths in the grass and hyenas at the carcass, they also had to watch the branches above. No safe space. The death could come from pretty much anywhere. And as if predators, crocs, and birds weren't enough, the sky itself betrayed Homo habilis. 2 million years ago, East Africa didn't offer stability. It offered whiplash. Sediment cores from the region show abrupt swings between wet and dry phases, sometimes within a few centuries, sometimes even faster. Richard Potts, in his variability selection hypothesis, argued that these extreme climate shifts shaped human evolution itself. Only those gifted with the ability to adapt to both conditions were able to survive. For habilis, they were less an opportunity than a death sentence. When rains came, grasslands opened, herds thrived, carcasses were available to scavenge. But when the climate flipped dry, lakes shrank, plants withered, and prey animals vanished. That meant habilis had to gamble harder on risky food, more marrow, more scraps, more time at carcasses already contested by lions, hyenas, and saber-tooths. In effect, climate stress drove them deeper into danger, and starvation left its trace. Fossil assemblages from the Pleistocene show waves of nutritional stress. Teeth riddled with wear weren't just from tough foods. They were from desperation foods, gnawed because there was nothing else. Some habilis specimens under 10 years old already show the kind of dental destruction you'd expect in a modern elderly human munching on extra coarse sandpaper his whole life. The climate shocks didn't just sap calories, they broke communities. In harsh years, groups may have splintered in search of food, leaving individuals more vulnerable to predators. Others may have clustered tighter around dwindling waterholes, which meant running straight into the ambush zones of crocodiles and big cats. So when the sky darkened, Homo habilis was squeezed from both ends, empty stomachs on one side and teeth on the other. Survival became a treadmill. Never quite enough food, never quite enough safety, and never a moment when either was guaranteed for long. For us, climate change has become a slow-motion crisis. For habilis, it was immediate, brutal, and inescapable. We've talked about the predators and the climate, but there was also a third threat we've yet to talk about: us. By 2 million years ago, East Africa wasn't just home to habilis. It was a crowded stage of hominins. Paranthropus boisei, the nutcracker man, roamed nearby with jaws like industrial pliers, perfectly adapted to grind tough plant foods that habilis' worn-down teeth couldn't handle. Homo rudolfensis may have overlapped too. A larger, more robust hominin with a brain nearly a quarter bigger. And looming above them all, like the master of this game, was Homo erectus. Erectus was trouble. With a brain that sometimes doubled Habilis's in volume, Erectus also brought sharper tools, Acheulean hand axes, cleavers, picks, where Habilis had only Oldowan flakes. Archaeological sites show Erectus experimenting with fire, organizing hunts, and butchering carcasses with ruthless efficiency. What Habilis had to scavenge in scraps, Erectus claimed with force. The imbalance shows in the fossils. While Habilis skulls top out around 600 cubic centimeters, Erectus averages nearly 1,000. That gap isn't just numbers, it's memory, coordination, planning. Erectus could cover more ground, exploit more foods, defend kills longer. In a fight over a carcass, Habilis wasn't just smaller, it was outthought. And the competition may not have stayed at arm's length. At Swartkrans Cave in South Africa, Paranthropus remains bare cut marks that suggest they were butchered by early Homo, perhaps Habilis, perhaps Erectus. If Habilis could kill its cousins, there's no reason the opposite wasn't true, especially given Habilis's build. Threats are really starting to pile up. Habilis had to worry about dodging crocodiles, hyenas, big cats, and relatives who had better tools, bigger brains, and a growing monopoly on the very resources Habilis needed to stay alive. All that with a body that couldn't sustain heavy shocks, had a small brain, and was wearing down at the same pace our dogs do. Now, the obvious question is, how did Homo habilis survive at all? Part of the answer lies in numbers. Paleoanthropologists estimate that habilis lived in groups of 50 to 80 individuals. In a world where most carnivores hunted alone or in small packs, those numbers mattered. A cluster of eyes could spot danger earlier. A dozen hands could mob a predator long enough for the rest to scatter. Strength in numbers doesn't guarantee safety, but it buys time. One gorilla, 100 men. Same idea. Technology, limited though it was, also counted. The Oldowan toolkit wasn't flashy, just flakes and choppers, but it opened up a calorie stream no other primate had fully tapped: bone marrow. Breaking femurs for the fatty tissue inside gave habilis access to dense energy at a time when fruit or meat might not be available, without requiring the crazy bite force other scavengers needed for the same diet. That extra 200 or 300 calories could mean one more day of life. Sometimes, survival really is math. There are hints, too, that habilis experimented with simple structures. At one site dated to about 1.7 million years ago, archaeologists described a possible windbreak or hut. Nothing permanent, just a circle of stones that might have supported branches. If true, it suggests habilis could improvise shelter against wind and predators. Not really architecture, but it was a start. And yet, none of it was enough. The same traits that kept habilis alive also ended up trapping them. Big groups made them noisy and obvious to predators. Scavenging gave them calories, but it guaranteed deadly conflicts with cats and hyenas. Bone marrow was useful, but still they were feeding on scraps. And whatever shelters they built, they couldn't hold back the climate or the flood of better-equipped cousins. So habilis lasted, astonishingly, by the skin of its rotten teeth for over 500,000 years. Long enough to prove they could carve a place in a hostile ecosystem, but not long enough to keep it, once the world tilted toward bigger brains and sharper tools. In the end, their survival wasn't a triumph. It was 800,000 years of daily punishment, a species treading water in a river that was already pulling them under. The story of Homo habilis doesn't end with a monument or a myth, but with a splintered shin bone from Olduvai, a cracked skull from a cave, the worn enamel of a teenager who never grew old. They survived for hundreds of thousands of years, but survival was never the same as safety. Every advantage they scraped together, stone flakes, big groups, scavenged marrow, was a temporary patch. Climate squeezed them, predators stalked them, rivals eclipsed them. By the time Homo erectus spread across Africa with sharper tools and bigger brains, habilis had already been cornered. The fossil record doesn't give us their last moment. No single bone says, "Here is the end." What it shows instead is thinning traces, scattered across time until the trail goes quiet. One day, they were simply gone. And maybe that's fitting, because for Homo habilis, death was never rare or exceptional. It was the backdrop of life, baked into their teeth, written into their bones, marked by the claw, the fang, and the bite. If you want to picture their legacy, don't imagine a triumphant ancestor standing tall with a tool in hand. Imagine a poor guy split in half between a giant crocodile and a tank-built leopard. That's the truest image of their world. When we ask, what was the worst time to be human? The answer isn't a specific year in recorded history. It's that long, 800,000 years lasting fragile dawn of our genus, when to be human meant nothing more than to be a slightly smarter prey. For Homo habilis, the cut to black came fast. For us, it lingers. We might be bigger and stronger than Homo habilis, but we're still yet to reach 800,000 years of existence as a species. Maybe we'll never get there. We might be more dominating, but does any of that matter if we end up sharing the same fate? Who really is the more successful one? The long-lasting or the short-spanned king? So the next time someone tells you the worst year in history was 536 AD, remember this. There was a time when every year was like that. When living past 12 made you exceptional, when predators defined your horizon, and when even a trip to the riverbank could be your last. If this reframed what you thought about hard times in human history, leave a comment. Which part of habilis' world struck you most? The crocodiles, the saber-tooths, or the fact that childhood itself was the deadliest gamble? And if you want more of these deep dives into the forgotten chapters of our past, the places where extinction and survival blurred, hit like, share this with someone who still thinks the Black Death was our lowest point, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because history isn't just about the empires that rose. It's also about the humans who didn't. Until next time, keep listening to The Echo,